advocacy, training, and nonviolent activism. Please drop by and visit the Peace and Justice Center, store, and resource library at 21 Church Street in Burlington, or call 863-2345 to find out more about how to get active in your world.
Oh, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one.
Good afternoon. My name is John Tucker. To my left is Vaughn Carney. To my right is Larry McCrory. This is Black History Month. And over the past few months, there's a lot of talk been about a film that is made recently about an event that occurred in 1966 when, for the first time in the history of the NCAA, 5 black players started for the Texas Western, which is now Texas El Paso. And that is, among some of us, triggered a lot of things about black athletes and the role that they have played in the Afro-American community over the years. Beginning in 1909 and 1908 and 1907, when Jack Johnson faced a particular problem of being heavyweight champion of the world, Ken Burns did a special on it called Jack Johnson, Unforgivable Blackness. And when a whole nation, when he walked in an arena, he was usually, everybody was there to see him beaten, and he stood up to a culture of oppression. Through the years, going to 1946 when Jackie Robinson was signed and sent to Montreal to play in the AAA baseball team. 1947 made his entry to the major leagues. And what he went through to be the only black player in the major leagues is once again a whole lot of history. But I passed over something. In 1936, Germany was emerging as the scourge of Europe and the world, preaching Aryan supremacy. Black athletes on the Olympic team put an end to that myth, headed by Jesse Owens. Larry?
Much to Hitler's chagrin, as a matter of fact. Yes, sorry.
And it put an end to Hitler shaking gold medal winners' hands.
Right.
Because he wouldn't shake the black athletes from America, the Black Legion they called them. And some of the other members of that team besides Jesse Owens, is interesting, Jackie Robinson's brother won a silver medal in that games. Ulysses Peacock, a great American sprinter. John
Woodruff.
Long John Woodruff.
800-meter winner.
Ralph Metcalf.
Ralph Metcalf was a silver medalist in the 100 meters and ran on the relay team. The other thing that was interesting is they also, another black athlete won the high jump. And he had attended Ohio State with Jesse Owens. So the role, and then in 1938, one of the greatest ballyhooed fights in the history of heavyweight boxing occurred when Joe Louis exploded the myth of Aryan supremacy once more with a first-round knockout of Max Schmeling. And for one night, he was the hero of all America. After that, he went back to being a Negro. So the role of the black athletes in America, and one of the interesting things to talk about in Jack Johnson, when he beat Jim Jeffords in 1910, was there were 13 riots in major cities across the country where Afro-Americans were murdered by white crowds. This is some of the history of America.
And in the wake of that, Congress passed emergency legislation banning the interstate transportation of fight films. And that was primarily how revenues were raised from fights in those days, because there was no television. Radio was in its infancy. and live attendance was very sparse given the geographic limitations. So people tended to flock to theaters to see these fights, and that's how the revenue was raised. This was a means of attacking the livelihood of those fighters, well, one fighter in particular who took part in these contests, and that was Jack Johnson. You know, if there was ever a case of Congress passing a bill of attainder, a law directed at a specific private individual, well, this was it. It remains a hallmark of legislative shame.
So moving on, 1966, in March of 1966, the NCAA, which is now called March Madness, 4 teams arrived at Cole Fieldhouse in Maryland. Texas Western, which is now University of Texas at El Paso, Utah, Kentucky, and Duke. None of the other 3 teams were known for, and it's very interesting that Texas El Paso had the first 7 players on Texas El Paso, and the captain of Texas El Paso, or Texas Western as it was known, was a black athlete. None of the other 3 teams didn't have one black player. What emerged out of that is this movie, Glory Road, that's being shown. And the Southwest Conference, the Atlantic Coast Conference, the Southeastern Conference had no black players. No Afro-Americans were playing in these conferences. What happened is Texas Western ended up beating the University of Kentucky, coached by the immortal Adolph Rupp. And some of the comments before was that there was no way. And the coach at Texas Tech told the coach of Texas Western that he was making a mistake by playing 5 black players because they needed somebody to settle them down. In other words, a white player on the court. And that to steady them down because blacks tended to be erratic. Brian Gumbel said on his program, one of the things was, in those days, was you played 3 at home, 4 on the road, and 5 if you got behind.
Yeah, so 2 at home, 3 on the road, and 5 if you're behind.
Yeah.
That was the rule of thumb in the
Well, no, but
those
later
days.
on it emerged 3 on 4, but just Brian Gumbel was doing it. So consequently, all hell broke out in America. James Michener wrote, this is a tragic mishap. There's something like this is the worst day in the history of American sports. Hot Rod Hundley, a well-known sportscaster and All-American at Virginia, played in the NBA, legend, said the only thing that those 5 black players couldn't do with a basketball was sign their names. And it went on. The white press was outraged. This was a mistake.
It was a fluke.
A fluke. And the bigotry evolved. And the other terrible thing was that there were some Afro-Americans, too, who didn't like it because they said these kids were used. What's interesting about that team is 9 out of the 12 players on that team received their degrees. All 5 of the starters have their degrees. They all went on to useful jobs and careers. But for me and others, the thing that we talked about, this was almost 40 years ago. That meant in 1966 that America was deeply ensconced in segregation. And on one side of the coin, there were people who had rights and people who didn't have rights. So who benefited from this? Who made all of this possible. That on the field of sports, which America, you hear all of the propaganda today from Americans. And I was talking to Dr. McCrory one day and was amazed about something he told me about when he attended the University of Michigan. Could you tell them about that, about your days at the
Well, this
university?
goes back to 1947, 48. And in those days, University of Michigan, which is one of the premier institutions in the country, blacks could only play or could only be on the track team or the football team. They could absolutely not appear in the baseball uniform or in basketball, which is just incredible to me. But that's
Well,
the way.
they were in a league, weren't they?
Yeah, Big Ten. It was the Big Ten, and
So
that was
the rule in the Big Ten.
That was the rule in the Big Ten.
So Northwestern, Illinois, Ohio
Right.
State, Michigan
That's
State,
right.
all of them participated in this. See, what, you know, and what we're trying to bring up is that to show you that why did Jackie, I hear people today talking about Barry Bonds and the records that he has. It's always been my contention and a large number of us, all the records in baseball were suspect up until 1947. Since some of the great baseball players in the history of the game weren't allowed to play.
Agreed.
No argument there.
No argument.
And yeah, I heard you talking about basketball. There was some great black teams in the 40s, 30s and 40s who had marvelous records. And if I remember, in the early 50s when the Minneapolis Lakers won the NBA title, they played a series against the Harlem Globetrotters. The Harlem Globetrotters in those days was not a clown act, as it is today. The Harlem Globetrotters beat them in a best 3 out of 5 series. Recently I was, and these comments going on, the Hot Rod Cunley comment I found particularly telling, that the only thing that these guys couldn't do with a basketball was to sign their names. And that goes to the heart of the matter.
Of course it goes to the heart of the matter, and that's the attitude. I mean, if you look at the history of this country, until now, incidentally, I mean, still is what I'm trying to say, it's built on myths. And these myths were all generated in order to, on the one hand, carry on the racism, but try to keep people calm. And one of the myths was that sports was the great equalizer. That if you looked at sports, they were all integrated, that people played together and so forth, and that was one way that, that blacks could, in quotes, pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Well, that was a myth, obviously. Everything that we've said up until now shows that, in point of fact, that was not an integrated institution. It reminds me very much, as you know, I'm a jazz musician, and it reminds me very much of the whole jazz scene, because the same thing was said about jazz, that here is the great integrator. Here, people who have talent can all appear together. That is absolutely not true. In 1939, for example, you could not have a mixed band on the stage in America. It was either black or it was white. As a matter of fact, Duke Ellington's band, Duke had 2 very light people in his band. Juan Tizol, who played trombone, and he was from the Caribbean, and Willie Smith, who happened to be the uncle of my fiance at the time. At any rate, the point is that those 2 people were very, very light and could be mistaken for white. And so when Duke Ellington's band played in Detroit, for example, they had to darken the faces of those 2 people so that they would not stand out as being white, and therefore give the impression of an integrated orchestra. And it wasn't until Benny Goodman came along and put Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton in his group, where 2 races could be on the same bandstand. So, I mean, all of these are myths. And that's what we're talking about.
Well, you know, just recently, Vaughn called me last week. A young man, first Afro-American male in the history of the Winter Olympics, won a gold medal. There's been an uproar since then.
There has been a tremendous uproar surrounding Shawnee Davis of the south side of Chicago, who from the very beginning, when he started skating competitively, had engaged in various feuds with the U.S. Skating Federation over training, over funding, over any number of features. Shawnee Davis, as a matter of fact, received his training in speed skating in Calgary, Alberta, not in the United States. He trained and practically lived in Calgary during his formative years. He was raised by a single mother. What gave rise to the current controversy was a request by one of the other members of the U.S. men's skating group for Shawnee to participate in some sort of chase race that had been put together. As was his right, Shawnee said, no, I'd rather focus on my specialty, which is the 1,000 meters. That's where I have the best chance of winning a gold medal. That's my event. And this would be a distraction.
And that's what I came here to do.
Yeah, that's what I came here to do. And of course, rather than letting it go, the teammate, in his self-righteousness, had to go before the media and make a news item of this little contretemps. Shawnee Davis, as a result, noted that he has received a storm of hate mail on his website and very nasty telephone messages in the wake of that, nearly all of which employ the word nigger. Here he is representing his country at the Olympics and has to be confronted in this way with what's a very unfortunate, it's a very unfortunate sideshow. In any event, as we all know, he went on to win the 1,000 meters and win his gold medal, and
Received a silver medal in the 1,500 meters.
Received a silver medal in the 1,500 last night, and made note at the press conference following the race that his teammate, who had previously criticized him, refused to even congratulate him or shake his hand after finishing behind Shawnee in the 1,500 meters and taking the bronze. Shawnee made note of that at the press conference. All this to say that what was an act of athletic discretion was turned into a racial issue by those narrow and bigoted minds among us.
Why did he have to go to Canada?
Because he and his mother could not get the appropriate funding for training from the U.S. Speed Skating Federation. That's why he had to go and train in Calgary, Alberta.
He would have been better off skating for Canada.
He would have been much better off.
Where he would have never been described as the black Canadian.
There you go. Thank you.
One of the stars, because I've been watching Canadian TV the few times that I watch anything in the Winter Olympics, I watch Canadian TV. One of the stars for the Canadian ice hockey team, which is a big sport in Canada,
yes,
is a guy named James Engler.
Jerome Agenla.
No, it's James.
doesn't matter.
Whatever.
It doesn't matter, but anyway. And they never use the term the black Canadian star. They just say the best all-around hockey player, Canadian hockey player since Gordie Howe. That's high praise, because Gordie Howe's a legend in the sport of hockey.
But let me throw something out for you fellas. Back in 1985 or 86, Jimmy the Greek Snyder, TV sportscaster for the NFL Today, had a few too many drinks at Duke Ziebert's restaurant in Washington, D.C., and made a number of statements which resulted in his being fired by CBS. To wit, he said that black athletes were superior as a result of slavery and the process of breeding. if blacks wanted to be coaches and owners, there would be nothing left in sports for the white people, and so on and so forth in this vein. As a result, a huge stink ensued, and Jimmy the Greek ended up being fired. Now, what do you make of his comments regarding, well, natural selection, if you will?
Well, how many head coaches are there in NCAA football today at Division I schools? 4 that are Afro-American in a sport that's dominated by Afro-Americans. In a sport that's dominated by Afro-Americans. And it's very interesting. There are no there's one black owner in the NBA.
Right, Bob Johnson.
Bob Johnson. There's no black owners in the NFL, which is 72% Afro-American.
Correct.
His wife owns now a team in the WNBA.
Johnson's wife, his ex-wife.
Yes.
Yeah.
But how many black general managers are there?
In which sports?
In all of them.
Well, in basketball, there are a handful, 3, 4. In football, professional football, there are none.
No, there's some in professional football. The general manager of Tampa Bay is Doug Williams, the former quarterback of the
Doug
Washington
Williams,
Redskins.
okay. I stand corrected.
And Ozzie Newsome is the general manager of the Baltimore Ravens.
Okay.
Until Art Shell was hired, and I think he became the 5th Afro-American coach in the NFL. Because up until he was hired, 19% of the head coaches in the NFL were Afro-American. Just recently, the Jets hired a guy who had been an assistant coach for 2 years. He was upped over a lot of guys who had paid their dues. Mike Singletary from the Chicago Bears,
Right.
who's a very well-respected coordinator, was passed over a number of times. Al Saunders. And I could go right down the line. The carryover from 1966 is not, to me, is not amazing. Because who was benefiting from this whole segregation thing? White America. And
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to say earlier, and that is that those of us like you and I, John, not Vaughn, but you and I, aren't surprised by any of this. I mean, we grew up in a society which was so blatantly this that it's not even funny, and so we didn't even expect anything. When the Philadelphia Phillies let a black cat out of a bag,
that's right.
when Jackie Robinson came to bat, black people weren't surprised by that.
No.
My God, that's been happening ever since we've been in this country, for God's sake.
Jackie Robinson was dead at 58. He paid with his life.
52.
Well, whatever, 52,
I
53.
sure wish you guys would get these things straightened out.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I'm gonna send you a memo
yeah,
on this.
it
Send
doesn't.
us an
The
almanac.
fact is, either way, he died very young.
He died too young.
Yeah, and consequently, I remember when Muhammad Ali announced that he wouldn't go into service, and how black athletes of that day came to his aid
Yes.
and met. The tragedy of 1966 is the aftermath of all this. 2 years ago, I was at the Basketball Hall of Fame as John Chaney, who's a good friend of mine, was inducted along with Moses Malone into the Basketball Hall of Fame. The NCAA that night announced with great pride that it had just signed a $6.5 billion contract for the NCAA in basketball. It is hard to turn on for top teams and not see Afro-Americans very prominent in this.
That's true.
And some of my friends in Philadelphia, those of us who grew up playing ball and so forth, one of the things that has evolved, because I have friends who are head coaches, is For example, I don't think there's been an Afro-American that ever gave up as much as Muhammad Ali did the day he decided not.
Absolutely.
He lost millions and millions of dollars.
Right.
Because the word is integrity.
And the simple fact is, Muhammad Ali would never have had to pick up a gun in the Army. He would have been in special services. He would have boxed exhibitions
Right.
for the
Just like
troops.
Joe Louis did.
Just like Joe Louis, just like
Joe
all the
Louis
others.
did, right.
When Arthur Ashe went into the Army, he was given the very cushy job as assistant tennis coach at West Point. That's how he fulfilled his military obligations.
Right.
So it wasn't a matter of personal safety
No,
or
a matter of
cowardice
integrity.
that drove that decision. It was
Exactly.
pure integrity.
Exactly.
And when he refused to take that step forward at the induction center in Houston, it was a seismic shock that went through not only the sports world, but through American society as well. And, you know, I think what we're really talking about here is sports as a metaphor for sociological ideas, sociological development in this country. You can tell a lot about the country through and by sports. Let's take the case of LeBron James, the high school phenom in Ohio, who jumped from St. Mary's High School, I guess in Cleveland or Akron, directly into the NBA with the Cleveland Cavaliers. The hand-wringing, the weeping and the wailing and the gnashing of teeth when that kid said, no, I'm not going to play ball for free at some college while everybody in the program is going to the bank. He said, the coaches are going to the bank with the shoe contracts and the TV contracts, you know, the staffs, everybody is going to the bank but me. That's a sucker's game. I'm going directly to the NBA because I want my money now. I want to go to the bank now. And that's what he did. And you would have been amazed. Well, you know, you guys wouldn't have been amazed.
No, we wouldn't have been amazed.
At the hand-wringing and the condemnation, oh, this young man has passed up the chance at a college education,
Right.
and on and on. What he passed up was the whole idea of being exploited for 4 years for free, while everybody else is cashing in on his talent. That young man is thoroughly modern in that regard, and I think that's what really angered so many sportscasters and writers and sports fans. Let me finish. Let me finish. And all he had to do was listen to the advice he got from Chris Webber, who is now in the NBA, former star player at the University of Michigan. Chris Webber said, they want to come down on me because I took money from a booster under the table while I was at Michigan. He said, well, put yourself in my shoes. The coach is driving around in a Mercedes-Benz about 73 blocks long. Everybody on the coaching staff is making 6 figures. My jersey is selling over in the campus store for $100, and I don't have enough money in my pocket to buy a pizza. What's wrong with this picture?
Yeah, but you know, the other thing is that David Stern, the president of the NBA, just outlawed these kids being able to come from high school. And I'm going to name some names. Some of the biggest stars in the NBA never went to college. Kobe Bryant, Tracy McGrady, Jermaine O'Neal. All these guys were selected first-team All-Stars. Yao Ming ain't never played in a college. Dirk Nowitzki never played in a college. But those are foreign players. And again, this rule was set up to stop Afro-American players from coming out of high school.
And passing up the minor leagues.
And passing up the minor leagues. Right now, out of Indianapolis is a 7'1" kid who's probably going to be the next great center. I just watched him play. This kid's got to go to Ohio State and play for a year. It's a waste of his time.
Well, Moses Malone is one of the best examples of somebody who successfully made the jump.
It goes right down the line. I mean, right now the big emerging star comes out of Orlando, a kid named Dwight Howard, who's second in the league in rebounding. You know, so the whole thing about America is that we have not given up. There's new ways that they express their racism. All the rule changes in sports have been directed toward these athletes. I'm going to give you an example.
They're after Tiger now, aren't they?
Oh, God.
Lengthening the
They're after
holes on
Tiger.
various golf courses so that they will be
What'd you say?
tiger-proof.
Tiger-proof.
Tiger-proofing the golf
Tiger-proof
courses.
the golf course.
Nobody wanted to
Oh,
Nicklaus-proof the
incredible.
courses when Jack Nicklaus was holding sway.
God, it's-
Hey, you know, but this is typical. And the NBA's rule banning high school
Yep.
players from jumping directly to the pros
Yep.
is directly aimed
directly.
at young black athletes. Now, ask yourself this question. What percentage of Division I black athletes graduate from college with a degree?
Yes.
What percentage of these kids actually leave college with a degree?
A lot of them go back to school later on.
20%.
Yeah, but they go back to
Some do.
Yeah.
20% leave college with a degree.
But see,
So
what
what happens to that other 80%, nearly all of whom do not make the pros? Where do they go? They didn't get paid for their services in college, but everybody around them was making money with the billion-dollar TV contracts and the shoe deals and the sports shows on TV. You know, it's a system of exploitation.
But it-
You know, if you wanted to take a singer, for example, let's say, you know, you've got, you know, a very talented teenage singer. The rule that the NBA has instituted is comparable to saying, well, this kid can't sing professionally until he goes to high school and sings with the high school choir, and then sings for 2 years after that with a church choir. I mean, how stupid and ridiculous is that? What you're doing is depriving these young people of their right to earn a living. And in the name of what? In the name of what? In the name of exploitation.
But it goes across the board and everything. Mark McGuire, for years, sat with steroids on his shelf, right in his cubicle. Sports writers never asked a word, never said a word. You never heard anything about Mark McGuire. They had to attack Mark McGuire when they saw some of those black players was taking them, and some of whom still haven't tested positive. There are black athletes right now banned from their sport who have never passed positive for steroids because somebody else said that. And you're a lawyer, Vaughn. Can you be convicted on hearsay in an American courtroom?
No. No.
That's my point. And then they tested the person and they don't test positive.
Yeah. No,
Jesus. East Germany and the whole Eastern Europe and Russian athletes from the 60s to the 90s, I mean, they were injecting their bodies with so many different kind of drugs that it wasn't even funny.
well, doping and masking elements were routine among foreign athletes.
And perfected in East Germany.
And perfected in East Germany and the Soviet Union.
Right.
But let's shift gears and try something else. Now, Bryant Gumbel has received a storm of criticism for a comment he made about the current Winter Olympics in Torino. Bryant said, "There's such a lack of diversity that it looks like a GOP convention to me, and that's why I won't be watching any of it." Comments?
Well, you know, I hear white sports writers make comments all the time, and they're never going after. And let me give you an example. Eddie Sutton, the head coach of Oklahoma State, had to step down from his job for a DUI. He's been involved in other stuff in head coaching. They ran the first story, and that's been the end of it. He ran into another car. And they've been trying to make all kind of excuses for him. He had a bad back, and he took his drugs with alcohol. You know, I mean, and my reaction to Brian Gumbel is, I haven't had much interest in the Winter Olympics because, frankly, I mean, if somebody could tell me who the 1996 winner was, and America promotes their propaganda on 3 things in the Winter Olympics. The Miracle on Ice, which they got 10 movies about, because they won the ice hockey championship. Skiing is not a diversity sport. ice skating. Go ahead, Larry.
No, you know your friend who writes books on this from California.
Ralph Wiley.
No,
Which one?
no, not
Harry
not
Edwards.
sports
Harry
books,
Edwards?
not sports books, but just books about racism,
Yeah,
undoing racism.
yeah.
Talks about the fact that rather than try to guess what's going on in these whole businesses, ask yourself, and incidentally, he pleads with white people to ask themselves.
Oh, Paul.
Yeah, Paul Kibble.
Paul Kibble.
If you look at a situation which is all white, like, for example, the Winter Olympics at least approaches, if you look at a situation that's all white, you should ask yourself, how did it get that way? Why is it that way? And I think what you'll see, if you're honest and look at it, is that the system is geared in this country to ensure that it comes out that way. It's geared, for example, the criminal justice system. Why are there so many black people in jail now? Because the system is geared to assure that that happens. And you know that, Vaughn.
Yep.
You know it better than we do. And you can go right down the line. Why, for example, before Tiger was golf so, in quotes, white? My God, when I grew up, we couldn't even walk on the damn golf course.
Unless you were
Unless you were a caddy.
caddying.
Unless you
Why
were
did they-
caddy.
why
So
did they work-
Of course that's going to be the outcome.
And one of the things I give Tiger credit for is, and this is what the other thing that really burns up the public, he never forgets
He never forgets.
to say Lee
Schiffer.
Elder, Charlie Schiffer,
Charlie
Ted
Schiffer.
Rhodes, who were never given a fair. Charlie
That's
Schiffer
right.
was asked to come on the tour when he was 47 years old.
That's right.
Yeah.
Lee Elder was the only black player and couldn't play in the Masters until he won a tournament.
Right.
The Masters didn't have anybody. I mean, and you know, and then I think of poor Arthur Ashe.
That's
And
right.
then before Arthur Ashe, one of the greatest black athletes and what she went through
Oh, yeah. Yep, I saw
in the
her. I saw her
1950s.
play many times.
Althea Gibson,
Althea
nobody
Gibson.
talks about Althea Gibson as one of the greatest women players who ever lived. Going in the back of these clubs. Couldn't come in the front door. Won Wimbledon, won the US Open, and if I'm not mistaken, I think she won the French too.
Learn how to play on the public courts in
That's
New York
right.
City.
In Harlem.
And you
In Harlem.
never, you see all these flashbacks
Oh.
at these tennis things about the past. You never see Althea talked about.
And she recently died in poverty.
Yep.
That's right.
And you know that was how she ended her days in obscurity and poverty.
And
But you know, you mentioned Tiger Woods, and one person he always gives credit to
Is his father.
Of course.
Is his father. And Earl Woods has been very vocal about his experiences, and he will tell anybody, and does. Not everybody loves my son. There are a lot of people out there who don't. He said, I have a number of sacks of hate mail that I keep in my attic, just so I'll never forget, and I can always be reminded by going and opening up some of the sick, vicious missives that are sent to my son. He said, these are from total strangers, people who don't even know him. Don't tell me that racism in this country is over, because I've got written proof that it's not.
Just last week.
And what a lot of people don't know is that some of these threats have been so vicious and so directed that Tiger Woods goes on to every golf course with 5 bodyguards in the crowd at all times. Did you know that? There are
Yes, I
5
did know that,
bodyguards
as a matter of
around
fact.
him in
Yes,
the
I
crowd
did know
at
that.
all times. That is necessary because of the vicious nature of the threats and hate mail that he has received. So I don't think we need to kid ourselves about you know, where we've come and you know, how far we have to go, because it's there and it's real. Now, Bryant Gumbel said something else. Now, I'll take issue with what he, you know. Of course, a lot of these Olympic sports require a great deal of money for training, and that necessarily screens out a number of black Americans. And you can take issue with some of that, but I won't. He also said it was related to him that, quote, "these are the greatest athletes in the world," unquote. And Bryant Gumbel's response to that was, "Don't make me laugh."
That's right. And here,
Comments.
and I want to bring you up to date about this racism. Over the weekend, Pittsburgh beat the University of West Virginia. The Big East is right now rated the #1 league in the country because of the caliber of teams that are in the Big East. A University of Pittsburgh kid was just taken to the coals because fans at West Virginia were saying things like, "Go back to Africa," and stuff like that to him. He gave him the finger. He didn't fight him. He gave him the finger. That wasn't appropriate of him. This is the only person that stood up for him on the ESPN was Michael Wilbon, the black sports writer for the Washington Post, who said, "I can think of a lot more appropriate things he could have done." And, you know, this is a college basketball kid. This is a 19-year-old kid. And I listened to this white sports writers going on, "Well, it's only a name."
Oh, God, please.
Well, call women the B word or the S word. It's more to that. Sometimes names hurt worse than blows.
Well, let's use this as a jumping off point for another incident. The fight that took place between the Indiana Pacers and the Detroit Pistons last season, wherein certain fans came out of the stands and down on near the floor, swore at players, threw beer on them, and attempted to fight with them. The players were reprimanded for defending themselves. Ron Artest was suspended for the remainder of the season as a result of this.
Lost $5 million.
Now, what is the message that's being delivered
You
there?
know the message.
Shaquille O'Neal has talked about it, and a few other players who have the gumption have talked about it. What it is effectively saying is that because of the money you black people make, you have forfeited the right to defend yourselves and to defend your dignity. In other words,
And to defend your wives.
and to
for that
defend your
matter.
wives. That's that New York Knicks incident.
Yeah, that's right.
You know,
And you can't.
you
That's
have
right.
forfeited your rights because you're being paid.
And what could be more frightening than some big angry black man coming up in the stands because somebody threw a bottle of water in his face while he was laying flat on the table? And the other thing was that the guy from the Detroit Pistons precipitated the fight.
Yeah.
And that was the amazing thing to me. And the Indiana Pacers ended up, I mean, I'm watching them fight down on the floor against guys coming on the stand, got 25 and 35 game suspensions.
Yeah.
So there's a message. Look, the majority of our audience is white, and you've got to appease them. And Shaquille O'Neal called themselves gladiators. The only difference between them and the Roman gladiators is they get paid. It's the same thing in football.
But you shouldn't have to forfeit your fundamental rights to human dignity simply because you're an entertainer and you're being paid. Would they, for example, require that Tom Jones allow fans in Las Vegas to throw drinks on him if they didn't like his singing because he's being paid? Of course not.
No.
So what is it? What is driving this?
Race.
Of course.
The
Absolutely.
color.
Absolutely.
There's nothing more frightening. And and I've gone through this in my own life, and you two kidding me. I've heard white men say worse things than me. And yet I'm looked on as a demon.
Of course.
I have never said anything that I didn't come out of my mouth that I didn't think was the truth. Now, I could have been wrong, but that's how I felt, and it's the truth.
You guys.
Seldom wrong, but always certain.
Yeah, you guys are worrying me a little bit because I keep getting this feeling that you're surprised by all this.
I'm not. You know I'm not.
not.
God, I mean, listen, the University of Chicago did a very interesting study a few years ago in which they interviewed a large number of white adults about race, quite frankly, and between 50 and 60% of the white adults that were interviewed or that were asked the question about blacks, between 50 and 60% thought that blacks were more violent than whites, that whites were more intelligent than black people, that black people were more desirous of living on welfare and not supporting themselves, and it goes on and on and on. And these are open interviews. Can you imagine what the real numbers are?
Sure.
Listen, folks, we are living in a very racist country, a very racist society, and these things are to be expected.
You know,
they're not surprising.
Well, look at the double standards that
Of
are
course.
used with respect to professional athletes.
absolutely.
You know, if a white athlete demands to be traded because he's not being paid what he thinks he's worth, the fans fall in line behind him. Poor guy. They're not giving him what he's worth. It's a shame they let him get away. Let a Barry Bonds or some other black superstar demand to be traded because he feels he can get more money and greater appreciation elsewhere. Immediately, the attitude of the fans changes to, he's ungrateful, he's selfish.
He's making more money than anybody else is right now.
Yeah.
Why isn't he satisfied?
That's right.
And on and on and on. I mean, it's,
you know,
So
he's an ingrate.
incredible double
So you
standard.
believe
But it's a
that
double standard.
what happened to the Minnesota Vikings early in the season, that no white athlete ever rented a boat and had strippers on it and had a private party and got
Yeah, right,
suspended
right.
and got traded? I mean, think that's what happened in Minnesota this year.
Yeah, oh no, I heard about that
and,
boat, that
and,
boat
and
party.
are going to get are getting sentenced.
I know. Yeah.
I'd like to get us back to your opening point,
Go ahead.
John, because I hope that everybody who's listening to this program goes out and sees that movie, Glory Road. On the other hand, and the movie is well done, except that those of us who know that situation very well will realize, or have already realized, that they left out an awful lot about that. They left out, for example, what Adolph Rupp said in the dressing room
Oh yeah.
to his players, and that should have been said, or that should have somehow been brought out.
Well,
Well,
they-
Hollywood had to perfume up that
I know that.
That's Walt Disney.
Believe me, I
It's
realize
Disney.
that.
yeah,
right.
Disney did the
But
thing.
see the movie anyway, because it really tells a very telling story about American society.
And there
what
wasn't
we're
a
talking
time that they played on the road that they weren't vilified and called the
course,
N-word.
of course.
And things weren't thrown at them and so forth. And that also didn't go into the fact, it's really interesting, the guy who coached Texas Western just retired last year so he never left that school.
Don Haskins.
Don Haskins retired, and he talked about the backfields of hate mail that he got.
Right.
And what a horrible year for. Here's a guy who had just coached and won his first and only. What a joyous thing for a coach. The man couldn't enjoy it because he was getting all this guff. And then, on Brian Gumbel's show, the reporter from the Sports Illustrated was in the dressing room when Rupp was outraged.
In the Kentucky address.
In the Kentucky dressing room.
Right.
Where Rupp was outraged at the players. And here's where the conspiracy of silence comes along in the group. Pat Riley
Well, what did Rupp say?
called them all coons. You letting yourself be beat by these coons and, some other things.
Yeah.
Here's where the conspiracy of silence comes in it. Pat Riley, who was on that team, Louis Dampier, and all the guys who played on that team swear none of that happened. And that...
And he is a sportscaster who is right there listening to it.
Yeah, and here they describe him as a man who just was strong in his views. And I have a friend named Harold Lear,
Yeah, right.
who was one of the greatest basketball players in the history of Philadelphia, who was the most valuable player in the 1956 Final Four. And Harold talks about playing at Kentucky when he and a guy named Sam Sylvester were the only blacks on Temple's team, and Rupp was hollering out on the floor, "Get them two niggas out the game. Get that coon."
Yeah.
And this was being hollered out to the referees. And what black coaches talk about among themselves, and I have noticed in watching games, it is not a smart thing to walk today out on the floor with 5 black players.
Right. Exactly.
Because I'm not saying it's conscious, but racism's so embedded in our souls in this country that the unconscious response is that you give certain players a break about certain things you can get away, like a touch foul or a little shove.
Right, of
And if
course.
you watch carefully, you've met some friends of mine at my birthday party, both of you did. And recently I had something happen. I went with one of them. He's an assistant coach. He's come out of retirement to do this to help a young black coach. And we were playing in New England, in Division II school. And what was amazing about this, the school from Philadelphia that has, of the 4 coaches, the head coach and 2 of the 3 assistants are all black. The team is predominantly white. I'm sitting in the stands behind their bench when a guy whose name I won't call, who's an old friend of mine of 50 years or more, because we played ball together, came and sat, and I said, aren't you going down there and shake the hand of the referees? He said, why am I going to shake their hands when we're going to get hosed? And when we walked into, you could hear the tenor of the arena change. And I won't name the school, but it's in Rhode Island. And somebody from this school's athletic department was behind me and was making fun of the young black head coach of this team from Philadelphia. And snickering, and turned and stopped when I caught his eye. And I said, what are you laughing about? And so consequently, this stuff goes on all the time.
Sure, yes.
And my reasons for what makes 1966 so pivotal is who was benefiting from this system in this country in 1966, and children have been born since. I know that all of us are parents on this panel, that we are very influential in the raising of our children. And what we think and feel get passed on. So that's why I know race is not dead in America.
What do you think the progress has been? What's the difference between 1966 and 2006?
They found out they could make more money. They could win. And coaches are about winning. There's a very famous football game that took place in 1970. Bear Bryant broke the back of segregation in Alabama because he invited USC in a private meeting. He and John, and this is a true story, he and John McKay had to meet at the airport to discuss USC coming to Allegiant Field in Alabama to play at University of Alabama. Well, they ended up kicking the crap out of the University in Alabama. It was Bear Bryant.
Bear Bryant.
Because
Right.
one of the stars of the team, not just Cunningham, but the other star, because I just saw the documentary again.
Well, Clarence Davis was from Birmingham,
Yeah,
Alabama.
he was from
and couldn't play
Birmingham.
for Alabama.
Couldn't
Yeah,
play
and
for
couldn't play
Alabama.
for Alabama.
That's right.
And so consequently, the next year Alabama signed his first black player, which is a guy who's now the coach of Mississippi State.
Sylvester Crooms?
No, yeah,
Yes.
he was a center. But the school in the Southwest that had his first black player, and you never hear about this coach since he did it. In the 1950s, Prentice Gart played for the University of Oklahoma.
Oh, yes, he did, right.
For Bud Wilkerson. You never hear them talk about Bud Wilkerson. They have never forgiven Bud Wilkerson in that part of the world for that. And consequently, and race is alive and well, and there have been some white men who have paid the price for breaking the code. Certainly Haskins at UTEP has paid a terrible price. And you can see the pain and hear the pain in this man's voice as he got the hate mail. Branch Rickey paid a price.
Yep.
You know, the coach of the Dodgers at that time.
Walter Alston? Or was it
No,
him?
No,
the
that-
Rocher
no, that
was
was
fired. It was Clyde Sufrith or somebody like that. Charlie Dressin. And Jackie Robinson played first base, and that's what a good athlete was. And just to show you how this racism continues, and this is why I'm going to show you an example, Vaughn. The other day I was watching a show, and they were discussing great catchers. And they talked about Yogi Berra, Johnny Bench, and Mike Piazza. And I'm looking.
Wait waiting,
Well, I'm waiting for Roy Campanella's
waiting
name.
for Roy.
Yeah, 2 MVPs.
Waiting for Josh Gibson.
Well, but I mean,
Oh,
Josh
yeah.
Gibson didn't play in the majors.
He didn't play in the majors.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
didn't play in the majors.
But I'm not going to argue that.
I mean, he was
you know,
unbelievable.
Unbelievable. But Roy Campanella played
Well, he
10
did,
years.
Yes.
And was the best catcher in the National League. In fact, Gil Hodges had to move from his natural position and go to first
Right,
base
and go to
play
first base. Played first base. That's right.
And-
that's right.
They never mentioned Roy Campanella.
Well,
And I know he won 2 MVPs,
Yep.
you know, because he was the first black guy to win 2 MVPs.
Knew him well, man.
And I knew Roy because
So did I.
his sister had a store on 52nd Street
That's right.
in Philadelphia.
That's right.
Because my mother used to shop at her store.
That's
It was
right.
a dress shop. And, I mean, you are absolutely right about Josh Gibson, because I saw Josh Gibson
Yeah,
play
he was.
against the Philadelphia Stars at
He was pretty
44th,
good.
44th and Parkside.
pretty doggone good.
Yeah,
And-
he's pretty good.
See,
He hit 880.
I hear
home runs.
white sports writers talking all the time about Barry Bonds' record should have an asterisk because he's suspected of using
Right,
it. Well, as
right.
far as I'm concerned,
All of those guys
all
should have
them
an
guys'
asterisk.
records before
That's right.
1947
That's right.
should have asterisks beside.
That's right.
You know,
Of course.
I mean, there were some pretty fair ball players.
Pretty fair ball players who were barred from professional sports at the time.
And the one white player that I give credit for, when he was inducted in the Hall of Fame, who was despised by a lot of Boston fans, was Ted Williams.
Yes.
The day he was inducted,
Here we go.
and I'm going to close out with this, and I want to give Ted Williams some credit for this. Ted Williams' statement was he would never be comfortable with the Hall of Fame until the great Negro players were inducted. That
Right.
was in his speech.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, today we're going to close.
Before we close, let me just say one thing. I'd like to speak to the issue of Pete Rose and his induction into the Hall of Fame. The powers that be in sports have never forgiven Pete Rose, not for gambling, but for speaking out against racial injustice back in the late 60s and the injustice of the Vietnam War. That's why he's really being punished. The Hall of Fame has inducted alcoholics, drug addicts, wife beaters, felons, racists, drunkards, and a whole range of other miscreants. And to keep out Pete Rose in the
Right.
light of that,
There was more.
I think bespeaks really
And,
an
on
unspeakable
that note-
hypocrisy. And I'll let you finish, John.
Yeah, I'm going to finish because Pete Rose, and I just want to clear up one thing. The other thing they didn't like was he hung out with the black players on the Cincinnati Reds.
Well, that too.
And he said, why wouldn't I hang out with them? They were the guys that could play the best.
And they had more fun.
And he had more fun. So what am I saying? What we're saying on this panel is race in America is alive and well. And sports has played an important role in cracking some of the barriers, but still in keeping the barriers up. And then in closing, we're going to be doing another show in another week. And we will be moving on another topic because Black History, I don't know if I believe in Black History Month. I don't understand why we have to have a special month for Afro-Americans since we're such a part of the history.
Black history is American history.
That's right. And in closing, the last thing I want to say is I know that we're working very hard to make sure the minorities in Iraq get the right to vote. And I wish that we would work as hard in America for minorities to get the right to vote in this country.
Thank you.
Good. Excellent.
Okay? We're done. It's 5 minutes to 2. Am I good or what?
Welcome to the Peace and Justice Review, a weekly program dedicated to examining important issues involving human rights, economic and social justice, the environment, and struggles for peace around the world. This program is sponsored by the Peace and Justice Center, which works to create a just, peaceful, and ecologically healthy world through education, advocacy, training, and nonviolent activism. Please drop by and visit the Peace and Justice Center, store, and resource library at 21 Church Street in Burlington, or call 863-2345 to find out more about how to get active in your world.
Oh, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one.
Good afternoon. This is John Tucker and Dr. Larry McCrory. Once again, we're happy to be with you. Today, we're going to start the program talking about the importance of music in the Afro-American community. Harking back to slavery, music was the one way that we as a people were allowed to communicate our feelings, our desires. It was the very essence of us. So I'm going to give you over to Dr. McCrory. Larry?
Thank you, John, and I'm delighted to be here, as always.
Yeah.
Let me begin by just saying that I have been lecturing on the history of black music. And in the last several lectures, I was amazed that people came up to me afterward and said that they had no idea that there was so much racism in jazz. And I was shocked. But you see, that's what happens when you're my age, or our age. If
Right,
you don't
it's
mind
our
my
age.
saying so. If you're our age and have lived through all of this, then I suppose it is somewhat shocking to hear people who don't understand these things. So that's one reason why I'm glad we're talking about this. But you mentioned jazz beginning, or music, black music, beginning in slavery, and that's absolutely correct. And if you think about the setting, the slaves, of course, brought African music along. The problem there was that African customs and languages and so forth were prohibited in the slave system, or by the slave system, were prohibited under penalty of death. And so these slaves, in order to try to hold on to some of their African customs and so forth, had to turn to something that was, in fact, not prohibited, that was allowed in the slave system. And the obvious vehicle was music. And the obvious vehicle there was religion. And therefore, the slaves developed the spirituals. And that was the beginning of all of this.
So their religion or Christianity?
Christianity.
Oh, okay.
I mean, no other religion, no slave religion, of course, was acceptable. So Christianity. And that became their way of carrying on the African traditions and so forth. So the spirituals then evolved as a mechanism for doing this. And that was the beginning of black music in America. From there, we went to the blues, which was very much like the spirituals, except that moving away from the religious thing and into a more popular setting. Then the theme switched from strongly religious to more of the real problems that the so-called emancipated people were suffering. The loneliness, for example, of the North, the segregation, and so forth and so on.
So the blues was a way for them to express
The blues
their,
was
yeah.
a way for them to express those kinds of feelings. I mean, it was poetry, but the same basis as poetry because they talked about love, they talked about sex, they talked about the troubles that they had. They also talked about the joys and the part of them which would overcome whatever the adverse conditions were. So the blues were not necessarily sad, but they were methods of expression, methods of coping with the horrendous situation that they were in. And then from the blues came jazz and up to the present time. But it's all black music. It's all invented by blacks. And for the most part, black people have been on the forefront of the development of jazz.
Created.
They created it, and the major developments in jazz have been by black people. Louis Armstrong, for example, was a very important element in the evolution of jazz. Charlie Parker, who I think was the greatest jazz musician who ever lived, was also a force like Armstrong in terms of steering the music, in terms of helping it to evolve. At any rate, jazz is black music. Now, the interesting thing to me, and to you, I'm sure, because you and I have not only studied racism, but in point of fact have lived through some of the most horrendous racism that you can think of. The interesting thing is that jazz, like everything else in this country, has been beset with racism. And in the early days of jazz, there was no mixing of musicians. There were white bands and there were colored bands or Negro bands or however you want to describe them at the time. And there was no mixing. And one of the things about all of that whole apartheid system in the United States was how silly it all was. I mean, how ridiculous it all was. If you really think about it and think about a rational basis for it, it just falls apart completely. For example, Duke Ellington had and Duke Ellington was one of the greatest of all musicians. He was artist, he was composer, he was arranger, he was everything. He was beyond category, okay? But in his band, and incidentally, I know that this was your father's band, incidentally.
Grew up with it.
Okay, but in any case, in that band, there were three very, very light or fair musicians.
Right.
One was Juan Tizol, who was Puerto Rican.
Right.
Another was Barney Bigard, who was a Creole from New Orleans. And the third actually was Willie Smith.
That's right.
Willie Smith happened to be the uncle of one of my girlfriends way back, and so I knew him well. At any rate, Willie could have passed for white anytime he wanted to. The point was that here were three very light-skinned musicians. Now, when they went to play in Detroit, and when they went to make a movie, those three had to have their skin darkened so that they would not look white, so that the band's showing would not look like
it was integrated.
Like it was integrated. Now, I mean, really, you know, even though I lived through all this and knew it, it's even hard for me to believe that a society could be that screwed up. Okay?
Well, you know, the other day you and I were talking about some of this, and the big raging argument with my father, and I told you this,
yes,
and my godfather was it Duke or was it Count?
Yeah, I know.
But you pointed out something very important to me. They had to be Duke Ellington, and Count Basie had to be Dukes and Counts. But why?
Well, it is interesting. And if you play around with that a little bit, again, it seems awfully silly. but it shows how deeply embedded this country is and was in racism. It shows that. For example, Paul Whiteman was called the king of jazz.
Well, that's an appropriate
Now,
name.
But let me tell you something. If you ever heard
I
Paul
heard Paul
Whiteman's
Whiteman.
orchestra, I mean, he didn't know anything about jazz,
Right.
okay? But he was called...
George Gershwin made him famous.
he was called the king of jazz. Benny Goodman, who incidentally was a fine musician and a good jazz musician, was called the king of swing. So we had these two kings sitting there, and then we have the duke and the count and whatever else. I mean, it's very interesting, but I don't want to make a big deal about that.
Well, I think it's an important issue.
And I certainly don't want to put Benny Goodman down, because Benny Goodman was the Branch Rickey of jazz.
That's right.
I mean, up to that time, there was no mixing on that bandstand. And the normal modus operandi was that the white bands, the white jazz bands, had all the good gigs. They played the big hotels and so forth. They were on the radio, broadcasting and so forth. Whereas the black bands had to play in, you know,
Play the chicken bone circuit.
playing the chicken bone circuit, of course. And the white guys, as soon as they got off of their gig at the big hotel, would run down and try to find where the black
Oh, go
guys were
jam.
playing, so they could learn something.
What separated black music from the rest of music in America also was the drum,
Well, of course. Well, of course. And
which not only had African roots, had Cuban, right? Had Afro-Cuban.
had Afro-Cuban roots,
Right.
of course. And incidentally, that's still very, very strong in Cuba. At any rate, let me finish this.
Again, a slave-inspired thing.
Again, a slave-inspired thing. But let me finish this.
Yes.
Benny Goodman,
Oh, yeah.
in 1935,
35.
and I remember this well because I went to
I
the
know who the
Earl
two musicians
Theater.
are.
I went to the Earl Theater.
I know who one of the musicians are right away.
Who's that?
Lionel Hampton.
Lionel Hampton was
And the
one.
piano
But
player
he wasn't
was
the first one. The first one was Teddy Wilson.
Teddy Wilson.
Who played piano in the quartet. And what
Right.
Benny Goodman would do is have this big band, and then he'd bring down 4 musicians, or 3,
Right.
plus himself, and they'd play the quartet thing. And the band and the group you're talking about then was a drummer and Benny Goodman,
Wasn't the drummer
and then
Gene Krupa?
yes, Gene Krupa,
Right.
and then Teddy Wilson on piano, Lionel Hampton on vibes, and that was the beginning of integration
Greatest,
of jazz. Okay, and it was a big step. It was like the Jackie Robinson story.
Well,
Teddy
didn't-
Wilson was the first.
Didn't one of our
Incidentally,
prominent
Benny
singers
Goodman
tour
caught
with a
lot of
white
hell.
band?
Oh yeah.
Billie Holiday?
Yes, Billie Holiday. Incidentally, Billie Holiday was another one. Billie Holiday was fairly fair, not
Right.
real light,
Not real fair.
but too light to perform with black musicians. So they had to darken her skin so that she could perform. I mean, there's a lesson here. There's a lesson here. There's a history lesson here, and there's also a sociological lesson here. And one of those lessons is how absolutely ridiculous this kind of racism is. But of course, we all know that.
Well, you know, Ellington, for me, all the fond memories I have of my father are tied in, because my father was so tied into music. And I realized that his generation, how important music was to them. I can remember my mother going around the house singing Billy Eckstine songs and Joe Williams. You know, I mean,
Arthur Price.
Arthur Price, Joe
Of
Williams, and music was just played, and whether it was because my parents ended up being divorced, in either house. When I went in that house, in my mother's house, my father's house, there's music. My father always had Duke, and I just wanted to share this with you. When I came back from Japan, I hadn't come home right away. I stayed a year in California, and I hadn't seen my father in almost 3 years, more than 3 years. And I was coming down the street in Philadelphia because I was surprising him. And I called him from the corner telephone. You know, he had the telephone booth. And as I got close to his house, he had hi-fi,
Yes, of course.
and he was playing jazz and diminuendo, crescendo and blues
Oh, that's
from Newport. And when I came in the
that's
house,
from
he was
the
he was-
Newport Festival.
That's right.
Yeah, right.
And he had been there when Duke recorded this.
Right. Okay.
And he looked up and he hugged me and we embraced, and he started telling me about the Newport Jazz Festival. And I just remember he had always had extra work. He used to have 2 or 3 nightclubs, and we talk about Duke Ellington and we talk about Count Basie, but I saw some other people, Cootie Williams.
Yeah, there were many, many, many. There were thousands of great players,
Hampton.
of course. Yeah. Another interesting piece of this whole thing, and this is,
Louis Jordan.
oh, I love Louis Jordan. And his Timpani 5.
Right.
I remember.
Go ahead,
Ain't-
finish, I'm
ain't
sorry.
nobody here but us chickens.
Ain't
Oh,
nobody
man, I
here
love
but us
it. I
chickens.
love it. Anyway, jazz, of course, is fairly popular now, but it wasn't always so. And as a matter of fact, in the 30s, the 20s and 30s, it was frowned upon, certainly by white audiences, but even among blacks, and it was sort of looked down upon. And it was the dirty music. It was music that you'd hear in a bordello or something like that. And Duke Ellington, of course, lived through all of that. Somehow found a way to maneuver right through that until, as a matter of fact, jazz became acceptable and even revered as it is today.
Didn't Europe have a lot to do with that?
Europe had a lot to do with it in several ways. One is that the Europeans were very, very receptive to jazz. But even more so, Europe did not have the depth of racism that the United States had.
Interesting.
And many, many jazz musicians, as you know, went to Europe and stayed.
The piano player who played with
Oh man, I mean,
Bud.
hundreds of them
Bud Powell.
went to Europe and stayed, and they were revered. I mean, they were.
But that happened after the war, right?
Well,
It's
yes,
very interesting how they
Yes
received
and no. I mean,
jazz
some people went even
and
before the
Afro-Americans
war,
when you
yeah.
look at their record in Africa and other places in the world. You know what I'm saying?
No, say it again, because I was thinking
It's
about
very
something else.
interesting. They had colonized Africa.
Oh, yes, okay.
And how the Belgians and
Yes.
Danes and everybody treated Africans, but at the same time they were revering these black musicians from America.
Yes, and many of them went over and didn't come back.
Yes.
They stayed there. Nina Simone, of course, died there.
Well, I was
I mean,
in
she said,
I was in Europe
I'll never come back to America.
when I was one of the most interesting things that I've seen. I was with my youngest daughter's mother, and we were traveling through the south of France, and a guy I grew up with in Philadelphia, a drummer, Bobby Durham,
I know Bobby Durham.
ran across the street,
Yeah.
called him my name, and she looked at me and said, "You're so vain. Why do you think somebody in France knows who Tucker is?" And I looked up, it was
And
Bobby.
there he was.
There
yeah,
was
right.
Bobby. And you and I come from a very interesting place in jazz and music, what it means, and we come from Philadelphia.
You mean Philly?
Yeah.
A home or the origin of a lot of great jazz musicians. Just on and on and on. The list is just incredible.
See, I grew up with Bobby, Tootie,
Yeah,
Tootie Heath,
yeah, I know.
Percy and Jimmy's
the
brother,
Heath, the Heath boys.
the Heath boys.
That's another family that's very much like the New Orleans clan.
Yes.
Yes, I mean all of them play and play well.
Bobby Timmons,
Yes,
the piano
of course,
player.
Piano player.
Lee Morgan.
Yep.
Bobby and Lee were playing with the Jazz Messengers.
Yes.
Art Blakey.
That is correct.
I had guys that I was, you know, and it was really funny. Philadelphia was a hotbed of music. You and I talked about this. And I was kidding you the other night when I brought up Lawnside.
When you mention Lawnside, you have no idea how many memories you brought back.
Well, you don't know how many memories you back when I go and hear you play.
Dear.
Because I know you were in Chicago, Jackett, and all the great horn players that came out of Chicago.
Yeah.
The guy who they made the movie about, Around Midnight.
Oh, God, yes. Well, actually, he was from New York, but that's okay. Chicago had a lot of great players, and I played with a lot of them. As a matter of fact, when I was in Chicago, and I was there for 11 years in graduate school and also as an assistant professor in the medical school, and so I got a chance to play with an awful lot of them. And at that time, a whole group of great jazz musicians came up from Memphis. Harold Mayburn, Booker Little,
Right.
Frank Strozier, and it's on and on and on. And I was playing with all those guys in Chicago.
But there was two guys that came out of Chicago, and I'm trying to think of that. One was a tenor player, Gene
Well, Johnny Griffin was
Yeah,
one of my
and
favorite
Gene-
musicians, and he was from
Ammons.
Jug. Jug borrowed my horn one night.
Oh,
It's
man.
Let me tell you just a short story about this, because it really shows you how great this guy was. He borrowed my horn because he had pawned his,
Right.
and he borrowed my horn, and incidentally, I went to the gig with him because I wanted my horn back. Anyway.
So he wouldn't pawn your horn.
Yeah.
Good.
At any rate, he took my horn and had a raggedy reed. It didn't matter to him, and he picked it up and he blew a note. And I looked at him and I said, "That can't be my horn, man." I mean, the walls were shaking from his tone.
Gene
Big
Ammons.
sound.
Gene-
Big sound.
Gene
man.
Ammons was
Oh,
one of the
God.
greats, man, because I remember
Oh.
going to, and you and I had
I know what you're gonna say.
we had a common friend in Chicago,
Oh. Yeah?
piano player,
Yeah.
Jody Christian.
Yeah, of course. I played with Jody for years.
Jody and I met in Japan.
I know that. Jody was a friend of the Japanese piano player. Toshiko.
When
yeah.
I was in Japan,
Right.
Jody was teaching Tocho
Right.
to make the switch to jazz.
Yeah. Well, Jody and I played together.
Watanabe.
The first 2 years that I was in Chicago, Jody and I had a gig, and then Jody got a better gig, so he left, and Harold Mayburn, one of these guys from Memphis, took over, and that's when I met Harold. And all of us played with Morris Ellis's big band in
Right.
Chicago. Chicago has always been a very profound and very important jazz spot. But a lot of good musicians came out of there, and Jug was one of them. There's no question about Gene Ammons, Dinah Washington, and they all came through the same place. There was one, the black school there, the black high school.
Dunbar?
I've forgotten.
Or
the name
Westinghouse?
of it. I've forgotten.
No,
the name of it.
Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, yeah.
But they had a jazz program that was incredible, and all these guys, Jug went there, and all the people you're talking about went there, and they all came out. And Dinah Washington, that wasn't her name, but I mean she adopted another name, but she went there.
There's a woman, I mean, the thing that bothers me in his history is when you talk about the race, I thought of Sarah, Ella, the chick my mother loved, played piano also.
Yeah,
Um,
they're from New York.
what's her name? Guess who I saw today?
Yeah.
I Saw You.
Yes.
That was her song.
Yes.
Dinah,
Carmen
McRae.
McRae.
That's the name that just, forgive me, folks, because I just blacked it out.
Oh man.
My mother adored Carmen McRae, and
Yeah.
and again, so much of my life is tied around music. And
Yes.
later on in my life, when my father was dying, for 7 years across the street from my father when he had cancer, and they refused to tell us when the end was going to come because he refused to die. But living across the street from my father was a very well-known young musician.
Tenor player.
Yes, Grover Washington.
Yes.
And my father used to break Grover Washington's chops. Grover had a great big mega hit, Black Magic or something like that.
Mr. Magic.
Mr. Magic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my dad was a warm day, Grover sitting on his steps, we sitting on my father's steps, and we all talking. And he asked Grover, what is that you played on that thing, man? And Grover said, Mr. Tucker, what can I do?
Yeah, well, you're...
My father said, come in the house. He said, I'm going to let you listen to 27 choruses of a tenor saxophone player who is not even famous, where he don't honk or tweak the whole time, and you know what he put on.
Yeah, of course.
Paul Gonsalves.
At that Newport Jazz
At
Festival
Newport
thing.
Jazz Festival. One of the greatest horn trumpets, my father swore, one of the greatest solos ever played.
Well, he played on and on and on. He wouldn't stop. Duke wouldn't let him stop.
Why?
Well, because he had been out late
The night before, right?
He had gotten sort of messed up with alcohol and so forth, and he was late.
And Duke was...
He was late getting
yeah,
to the gig.
Right.
And Duke was angry. And so Duke put him up there and would not let him stop. And of course, the band in back is just playing all those riffs and things, and this guy just elevates. He ascends. He just goes up, 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 and it's an incredible.
It's an incredible piece because my father...
It's one that everybody should buy.
Show me the back.
If you can get your hands on
There's a
one.
blonde.
Yeah.
And this never happens at jazz festivals. Because jazz people listen to the music,
Yeah, I know.
pop their fingers.
Yeah, I know.
Down the aisle of the Newport Jazz Festival comes this gorgeous blonde with a mink, dancing down the middle of the aisle of the Newport Jazz Festival. And Duke, in some ways, even though he was a king in my mind, Duke was a perfect name for him because he was so smooth
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. Polished.
and polished.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, and there was a pride in me. I went to see him in Central Park one night. And that whole band was there. And the trumpet player,
Which one?
Cat,
Cat Anderson.
yeah,
Hit those high notes?
that's right. Well,
Yeah.
Cat and my father were friends.
Yeah.
And, you know, I just, you know, when I look at my life, I mean, the thing, and there's a lot about Vermont that I really do like. The thing that I do miss is the music.
Yeah, well, I did too. I did too. When I came here, I thought maybe I'd never hear jazz again, you know. And then I was lucky enough to get on the radio and have my own show with the University of Vermont's radio station. And then I went from there to a spot on public radio and had my own show. So I was trying to generate my own jazz, and it was, and I'm very thankful for all those opportunities. But you were telling a story, and you sort of got off on a sidetrack, and that was when this blonde came walking down.
Oh, my father said she swung, that place went crazy. He said,
That's right, he was there, wasn't he?
He was there.
Yeah, right.
And the place went crazy, exploded. He said the people were dancing in the aisles.
Yeah.
And when you listen to that, I have that.
Yeah, so have
Oh,
I.
I play that.
So if I don't have the
because-
video of it, but I have,
But, you know,
have the record.
and my daughter, Nicole, my youngest, has all of my 33 and the thirds.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful picture of this blonde.
Oh, really? Oh, she's
Yeah, on the
that?
back of the album.
Huh.
And the Newport Jazz Festival for me changed over the years. And
Yeah, but you know, that was the first one. I mean, that started this whole business of jazz festivals. Now almost every city has one. I mean, my God, I've never seen so many
some
jazz
have
festivals.
music festivals.
Yes, I know that. But jazz festivals are all over the place. But the first one was the Newport Jazz Festival, and then one in California. Those two.
I saw, you know, in Philadelphia, music is so important, and it still is. they had a battle of the horns. It was Bird, Gene Ammons, and a guy Gene Ammons used to play with all the time. I'm trying to think of his name.
If you want me to tell you?
Yeah,
Sonny Stitt.
Sonny Stitt. Lord, today. Oh,
I used to go down to, what was the club on Lombard Street?
the Pep was
Showboat.
one, the Showboat was the other
no,
one.
Peps was on the corner of
Right,
Broad and
of
South.
Broad and South, and around
But
the
on,
corner.
but on Lombard Street, there was a Showboat.
There was a Showboat.
And Ammons and Stitt came into that place one night. I mean, I was there. And I swear, these two tenors just fought each other
And
all
you know what I
night
saw?
long, man.
And it was at
Just
Reynolds Hall. You know where
incredible.
Reynolds Hall is in
Of course
Philly?
I know where Reynolds Hall is.
Bird made them put their horns down.
Yeah, I know. Of course.
And a friend of mine who ended up
I
being
keep telling you he was the greatest jazz musician to ever live, but
and
that's
Bird went up to him and said, I want to be able to play with him. And Bird looked at him and said, first you got to have it here.
okay. Yeah,
Look at this. And then you got to have it here.
yeah, right,
He said, but it's really important that you learn to read.
yeah.
And that's what people didn't realize about those guys. My father did not like Miles.
Yeah, well, I didn't when I first heard him, but I came to it.
Miles brought
I
me
came
along.
to adore and admire him. believe me.
You know, Miles,
Admire and adore
but
him.
see, I started out with Diz.
Yeah, well, so did I.
But I had a record that my daughter, my oldest daughter, broke that was a collector's item. It was Billy Eckstine's Big Band.
Yeah,
He had,
right. Yeah, Dexter Gordon.
thank you.
Yeah, Gene Ammons was in that band.
Right.
Dexter Gordon was in that band.
Dizzy was in that band.
Dizzy was in that band. Oh, that was an incredible band, man. It didn't last very long, but
Opus X I had by Billy Eckstine.
man, it was a wonderful group.
But you know what Richard Wright sent me?
What?
I love him. Richard Wright sent me the big thing in the 50s that was out, the 40s and 50s, the jam sessions.
Oh, right.
Jazz at the Philharmonic.
Yeah.
Larry, I was listening to that on air.
Yeah, what?
Who was the greatest two-handed piano player that ever lived?
Nat King Cole.
The left hand was as good as the right hand.
Nat King Cole. Nat King Cole was so good as a jazz pianist, and yet he's
known as a
He's
singer.
remembered by his singing, but I swear he was one incredible jazz pianist, believe me.
See, I knew about that because my father hit me up to it.
Yeah, he could play.
And the jazz at Philharmonic
Yeah,
with
he
Flip
could play.
Phillips and all of them there.
Yes, of course. I know all those records,
And-
believe me.
There's the piano player's not named. Because
Yeah.
in those days they used to name them. And it was
Well,
He was under contract.
if they were under contract with a record company,
Right.
then they couldn't be with another
Right.
record company, and therefore they use all kind of names like Hen Gates and all
Right.
that kind of stuff. Yeah, but I know the record you're talking about, and man, Nat King Cole plays the heck out of that thing, man. I loved it. Yeah, that was. I used to go to all those jazz at the Philharmonic things. I mean, that was big in those
Oh.
days, man.
see,
Big.
so much of our history is, and I worry about this, and what do you have to say about this? I worry about our history being lost.
Well, it's probably my biggest fear, and I say this every time I get a chance to speak someplace, because what I'm worried about is that we have brought up a generation of kids that, as far as I can see, are fairly ignorant of their history. And I think that's suicidal. In this country, I think that's suicidal. I don't believe you can survive
See, I think the young
without
man
understanding your history.
from New Orleans, the trumpet player,
Yeah.
and his brother
Yep.
are trying to revive something.
Yeah, I know they are. I know they are, and they're doing an awful.
And they
doing an
get an
awful lot.
awful lot of heat about it
Yeah, I know.
from the critics. Because what I see, you know, it makes me wonder. I see movies, and I never see movies that are about these men and women. you know, you see Louis Armstrong as an addition in some old movies and everything, but you don't want to see the movie because the only good thing about it is Louis Armstrong. But there's no movies about Duke Ellington and Count Basie. And Lionel Hampton has a whole collection. That's in Utah. You know, that's where he, right?
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying, and I certainly agree with you. But you cannot forget the society that we live in and the way all of us, black and white, have been socialized. You can't forget that. And if you read people who understand these things, you'll see things like, for example, there are two groups of whites out there as far as jazz is concerned. There are those who believe that jazz is not an art form.
Yeah, I've run into them.
And only black people can play it. And there are those who believe that jazz is an art form, but anybody can play it. And that's a funny kind of dichotomy there. And in this country, jazz is still not revered. I mean, I know it's popular, and I know that when you see these jazz festivals, that they seem to be crowded. But if you look at the population as a whole, jazz is a very, very small part of it.
But it's still big in Europe.
It's still big, it's very big in Europe, and that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. Europe doesn't have the deep-seated history
And resentment.
and resentment
See,
that this country has.
With some musicians who I don't want to name by race, have run into is a certain kind of resentment. I remember the young horn player that I had here. I guested him here in Burlington. The kid from Detroit.
Oh, yes, the tenor player.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they were having a jam session at City Hall here. And it was really lame how he was treated at first. And
Incidentally, he is a very, very well brought up individual.
so was the young man from California who's a tenor player.
Yeah, I mean, well, anyway. But you ask a very significant question and a very important question. And I think that as in everything else in this country, racism is alive and well. And it's certainly alive in music. It's certainly alive in jazz. That doesn't mean that people aren't playing together. My God, I mean, I'm playing with a whole bunch of guys here, all of whom are fantastic musicians and all of whom are beautiful people. They don't come any nicer. So I don't mean on a personal level,
Right.
but I mean in a systemic level.
Oh, I know.
At a
I tried for years, and I thought this was important. In New York City, there's a School of Performing Arts,
yes.
and they have a jazz band, and it's a very diverse band. And I thought it would be important for the kids up here to see these kids who are exposed to this music in a way that they're not, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Never could get them to agree. It's one of the reasons why I left the Burlington, and plus I didn't think that the Burlington Music Festival became the Burlington Music Festival. It used to be a jazz festival. And I'm very strict about that. You know, Zydeco is not jazz and not blues.
Yeah, I
And-
know.
And it's a form of music that I have a lot of respect for because of the roots of it. But it is not blues in the way that they were advertising it. I mean, and so I know some people label me, but don't ask me to give up my heritage and to pay that kind of price for me to entertain musicians that in my mind aren't jazz musicians or not blues musicians. Zydeco was a particular art form
Well,
that I have a lot of regard for. I hear it in New Orleans when I go there.
right.
And those people fought that music. That music represents them, and I think it has a place. But it's not the blues,
And it's not jazz.
and it's not jazz.
Of course not. And I think what you're talking about. Well, I was on the original board
Right.
of the jazz festival here. I was one of the people who helped to get started. And it really was a jazz festival
I know it then.
in those days, okay? And then you were on it too,
And it still was.
and it still was.
And then it became less and less.
I do understand the problem. And the problem is that jazz in general does not support itself. And that's what I meant by the fact that if you look at the population as a whole, jazz is a very, very small piece of it.
Yeah, but
And so they need to have things that will generate funds that people will come to. And I think that were it still a jazz thing, they wouldn't get the crowds that they get. Therefore, no, not therefore, but and so it's okay with me as long as you don't call it a jazz festival.
Thank you.
And that's the point you're making.
Yes.
I mean, you can call it a music and heritage festival.
Oh,
or
I have
whatever,
and I have
jazz
no
and
problems
heritage.
with that.
Okay, either do I.
You know.
as long as you're not false advertising.
That's right. Go ahead. So.
Okay.
And I'll be talking to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Oh,
We must talk more about it.
yes. You know, once again, you can slip around that way, to your right or to your left. Just slip around. I just think that there's so much that we, as a people, have contributed to American history. And that there should be some things that is strictly ours. Now, I know that sounds terrible in this day and age and sounds anti-diverse. I am not anti-diverse. But I would like to see people like Duke Ellington, Count Basie. A lot of the rhythms and beats that you hear have been inherited from people like that. You can hear the rhythms and beat and rap. You know, because the first rap didn't start when you heard it then. There are some wonderful pieces done by people who scatted. We call it scatting. And I just want America to be true to the true history. And the true history is that from the time Jamestown was settled, we were there. Maybe not as freed men and women, but so much of early America was built on the back of us as a people, and that's okay. And we paid a terrible price for that. The music of the 19th century, and I remember one spiritual in particular, go down Moses, way down in Egypt's land, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. And we were suffering under the strains of the worst kind of segregation in America today, in those days, which went on and on and on until the 1970s. But the music is such a huge part of us. Stevie Wonder. You can hear some of Count Basie and Stevie. Motown, which has been bought off.
the lyrics that Smokey Robinson read, the songs that Marvin Gaye sang, which is one of the great albums, What's Going On. It's still relevant today. And I can remember people like Sam Cooke, who never got a chance. I can remember that black artists, a lot of time, their pictures weren't on the faces of the cover. I lived 4 or 5 blocks away from Bandstand in Philadelphia when Dick Clark took it over. Black kids weren't invited. We weren't allowed to go to Bandstand in Philadelphia. Bandstand started in the 1950s. Right there at 46th and Market Street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Then Dick Clark took it over and made it a national thing. There they were, the Supremes, the Temptations. And the music was such a vibrant part of our community. It always has been. And and we're not even talking about the Afro-Cuban connection and the Latin bands. And so much of the slave history had to do with that music that came out of Cuba. That rock, to say, there's a wonderful movie, The Mambo Kings. Of course, there's Antonio Banderas and Armand Asante. I can tell you for a fact, as I grew up dancing the mambo and the cha-cha-cha and the merengue, that they didn't all look like Antonio Banderas, the members of the band. Tito Puente's band was a myriad of colors. And the drums and the timbres were all an important part of that. And again, the connection between Afro-Cuban music and jazz. And Dizzy Gillespie in the 70s went to Cuba and helped bring some of those musicians out who were still playing the music that originated with the slaves. And I think that Castro really doesn't want a lot of those music and dances performed down there. It's almost against the law. You know, it's important to note that not everybody in Cuba looks like Sylvia Esteban. You know, the great musicians and drummers and bands came out of those islands and that are connected. Everywhere the slave, when he took his music with him, that was true in Jamaica when you hear reggae, in the Bahamas, or when you go into Brazil, the great drummers in Brazil and all the music there. The African tradition started long ago. There was a wonderful jazz musician from South Africa, Ibrahim. And he tried to explain to people here when they were asking him when he wrote the music, he tried to explain that the music didn't come from him, that the music came through him, that he didn't own it. And I guess that's the difference in the cultures. The music is more than money. Sure, I know there's a lot of rich black musicians now, probably richer than Duke and the performers of the past ever seen. And I'm happy for them. Because those rhythms and those beats that you hear didn't start. They didn't invent them. They inherited them. The first big rap group, as you know, is the Last Poets. And they did it for other reasons. So consequently, people need to be careful when they take on music and label it theirs. I know that I'm older and I come from different eras. But I can tell you
that each generation in our group, and for young blacks in America today, is hip-hop, and I have no problem with that. With me, it was R&B, Ruth Brown, The Moon Glows, and doo-wop, along with jazz, because that was our beat, and that was our rhythm. But if you listen for all that music, what it had in common, the drum is still there. The drum is the constant integrator of our music. I know now that there are a lot of musicians that, I don't know if they're musicians or electricians, but that's not my problem. I'm talking about something that is almost like the heartbeat and pulse of Afro-Americans. And it's our music and our heritage. It was our way of communicating with each other. As Larry pointed out and has pointed out in his many talks, we have a living treasure in him because he played with some of the jazz greats in this country. You know, recently Big Joe died. We will never hear another Big Joe. He and I used to sit out on Church Street together and talk about those times, about B.B. King, who's in his late 70s, John Lee Hooker. See, everything today had a yesterday. And you know, somewhere we have let our young people down, making them believe that they're not connected. They are connected. Their sorrow and so forth that comes out in their music at times, the also their joy. But that beat remains the same. And Larry and I oftentimes talk. We have, and they have given people everything. You know, Charlie Parker was dead at 37, 38 years of age. You know, there's a man in Hollywood whose movies I try to go see, Clint Eastwood, who has tried to keep jazz in America open. He produced and directed the movie Bird. It's a tragic movie at the same time it's a movie. It's a music full of the kind of music that you'll never hear again. Charlie Parker was a genius, an absolute genius. There are young jazz musicians today that are trying to imitate him and to recreate him. And I could go on and on and on. I mean, I tend to relate to the older musicians more because they played it, you know, Sonny Rollins. But the music is important. And there has been, you know, and jazz played an important role. When Benny Goodman walked out on Carnegie Hall stage in the 30s, and he had Lionel Hampton and Teddy Wilson with Gene Krupa, it may not have changed things right away, but that was as much a part of the history in 1937 and 38 as Joe Louis beating Max Schmeling. See, there are people who come in this country really believing that black Americans haven't contributed to America. Oftentimes, a lot of the music that was being played in vaudeville and on Broadway stages were because of the fact, you know, George Gershwin wrote Porgy and Bess. Where do you think he got that music from? Come on. Use your brain. Think about it. And then for one reason or the other, you watch them push aside. You know, one of the greatest voices of all time, he was a jazz singer, but he was a great singer, was Paul Robeson. And because of politics, we took him away. See, there's always a way to get rid of us. Or there's always a way to discount and disjoint and change and forget really forget. When Harry Connick Jr. sings, I hear Louis Armstrong and the Neville brothers. We don't think about the Neville brothers. And I hope that one day Larry and I would be in a position to put on the kind of music that people really need to hear. Jenny Johnson did a wonderful job last Friday night, along with Larry McCrory and the band that they had put together, and Evelyn. They did a wonderful job of bringing us through that history with spirituals, the blues, jazz, R&B. Come on, folks. You may not put us in your history books. Your kids may not read us all the time. Tote that barge and lift that bale wasn't something that somebody just invented on their own. Those rhythms they learned down in the Delta, on the waterfront, as slaves were breaking their backs. This is the end of Black History Month, 2006. And once again, I would like to thank our audience, if we have one, however small it may be, and Channel 15, the wonderful people here, for letting us come in and share part of our history with you. It's not only a history that's in a book, it's also a personal history. But in Dr. McCrory and Big Joe, you had wonderful parts of Black America that will never be reproduced in a lot of other places. And it's really important to understand where and the role of music in the Afro-American community. I am in gratitude to Billie Holiday, Dinah Washington, Hazel Scott. I could go on and on. Sarah Vaughn, Ella Fitzgerald, Bessie Smith, Dinah Washington again, Ruth Brown. See, we had giants. They didn't get the exposure that everybody else got. They didn't make TV all the time, or the top radio shows. Nina Simone, Carmen McRae. And then there's Billy Eckstein, Arthur Prysox, Joe Williams. Hazel Scott is a name that a lot of people wouldn't recognize. She was married to a great American, Afro-American, named Adam Clayton Powell. Think about that. Adam Clayton Powell, where a lot of us are benefiting from all the years he spent in the House, in Congress. So there's all the connections. I can go into any black church on any given Sunday and hear those beats and those rhythms. It all started there. Those woeful sounds, those beautiful sounds, those marvelous voices. Thank you.